A thunderclap split the silence of global finance. 300 million United States dollars in gold from Burkina Faso halted without warning at a European port. No accident, no lawsuit. A decision shaped by power. And then, the unmistakable echo: if Africa wants to sit at the table of trade, it must first pay its price. In those few words, centuries of chains rattled back to life. But this time something shifted. This was not only about a shipment of gold. It was about the dignity of a continent, the right to decide its own future without begging permission from Washington, Brussels, or London. In Ouagadougou, men and women earning less than $2,000 a year looked up from fields and markets and asked, "How can our wealth be frozen with a single phone call?" Into that storm stepped Captain Ibrahim Traoré, not with compromise but with defiance. His voice carried the weight of history. This is not debt, this is control. Stay with us because this is not just another headline. This is the very future our ancestors prayed for. Subscribe and stand with us for an Africa that will never bow again. The shock was not announced in quiet memos or whispered corridors. It landed like an earthquake in Ouagadougou. Word spread that a shipment of gold, valued at 300 million United States dollars, had been seized at a European port. For farmers earning less than $5 a day, for teachers waiting months for salaries, for mothers who sold grain to keep medicine on the table, the number was beyond comprehension. Yet the meaning was unmistakable. Wealth meant for schools, hospitals, and food security had been stripped away before it ever reached African soil. Crowds filled the streets. Old men in tattered coats, women balancing baskets on their heads, students in uniforms, miners still carrying the dust of their work. Placards rose above the crowd with a phrase that cut deeper than any statistic. They steal in daylight and call it law. It was not a cry of despair. It was a declaration of clarity. The injustice struck with brutal contrast. In Western capitals, economies borrowed at less than 2% interest. In Burkina Faso, loans came with chained 7 to 9% interest rates, conditions written in languages few villagers could read, obligations signed by regimes long gone. The people saw it clearly. What was called policy abroad was dependency at home, and so the question became larger than the seizure itself. If a phone call from Washington could freeze the lifeline of a nation, then what did sovereignty mean? If gold mined by African hands could be confiscated before it built a single school, then was independence still real, or had it been reduced to a flag waving above debts no one chose? The anger was not reckless. It was rooted in memory. These were descendants of men and women who had seen cotton, cocoa, and oil carried away across oceans while their own families remained poor. They remembered promises of loans that turned into austerity, of aid that came with hidden conditions, of development plans that never reached their villages. They recognized the pattern. What happened to 300 million today had been happening in smaller sums, in quieter ways, for decades. A young man lifted his voice above the noise. "We never signed those debts. Why must our gold pay for them?" The crowd answered with thunder. They knew the truth of his words. Their parents had not signed. Their grandparents had not agreed, yet the chains of repayment were passed down like inheritance, binding generations to obligations they never chose. This moment was not only about money, it was about dignity. It was about a people who refused to accept that their future could be mortgaged on someone else's terms. Every chant, every raised fist, every banner painted in red and black carried a message far beyond Ouagadougou. Sovereignty is not for sale. In the quiet corners of cafes, in crowded buses, in the courtyards of mosques and churches, the conversation was the same. What good is independence if it can be undone by a banker's stamp? What good is democracy if decisions are written in foreign boardrooms? The air itself carried the weight of betrayal. Yet in that betrayal grew resolve. This was the pivot. Not just a protest against frozen gold, but a reawakening of memory, of struggle, of the unfinished journey toward true freedom. And it began not in palaces or embassies, but in the streets, among people who understood that justice without sovereignty is an illusion. In Washington, officials gave the episode a name, the Sahel lesson. The phrase itself carried an edge of arrogance, as though Burkina Faso and its neighbors were pupils in a classroom where obedience was the only acceptable answer. The lesson was clear. If Africa wanted access to global trade, it must borrow in United States dollars, repay with interest between 7 and 9%, and submit to rules written in offices far beyond the Sahel. But for the people of Burkina Faso, the numbers told a story of chains disguised as contracts. While Western nations borrowed at rates under 2%, African states were charged triple or even quadruple, their economies tethered to repayment schedules that drained budgets year after year. Hospitals remained without medicine, schools stood without roofs, roads dissolved into dust after the rains, and yet interest payments flowed like a river across the Atlantic. The injustice was not hidden in fine print, it was carved into the daily lives of ordinary citizens. A farmer in Kaya sold sacks of millet, but could not afford fertilizer for the next season. A teacher in Kudugu explained mathematics to students by candlelight because the school could not pay for electricity. Each story revealed the same paradox: a land rich in gold, cotton, and manganese, yet bound in poverty because its wealth was pledged elsewhere. So when Ouagadougou turned eastward, opening talks with India, forging channels with BRICS partners, and exploring alternatives to the dollar, it was more than diplomacy, it was defiance. For decades, the world had assumed that Africa would forever accept the role of debtor, forever pay in currencies it did not control, forever bow to conditions it had no voice in shaping. But this time, the tables began to shift. In New Delhi, refiners signaled readiness to purchase gold directly from Burkina Faso, bypassing European ports. In Beijing and Moscow, firms proposed technology to refine bars into finished products that could command 20 to 25% higher value on world markets. What had once seemed impossible, African wealth circulating outside Western control, was suddenly within reach. And the reaction at home was electric. In the cafes of Ouagadougou, elders spoke of long-forgotten dreams, of a time when gold mined by African hands might finally remain African. In the marketplaces, women selling tomatoes debated what it would mean if their nation could trade on its own terms. On social media, young voices carried a new refrain: "We never signed those debts." The phrase became more than a protest, it became a principle. The tension was undeniable. Western analysts warned of chaos, of sanctions, of isolation. They spoke as if Africa's only safety lay in submission. But for the people in the streets, the greater danger lay not in defiance but in surrender. Better, they said, to endure hardship with dignity than to accept comfort in chains. Even foreign headlines betrayed unease. Burkina Faso latest news appeared in reports across Paris, London, and Washington, framed as instability, risk, or rebellion. Yet for those within the nation, the news was something else entirely. It was a signal that the narrative was no longer controlled by others. The world was being forced to look, to listen, and perhaps, to reckon. This was not the end of struggle, but its renewal. Each step toward BRICS, each conversation with India, each exploration of new financial channels carried risks. Yet it also carried hope that a continent rich in resources might finally refuse to play a rigged game. Hope that the Sahel lesson would be rewritten, not in Washington's language but in Africa's own. Before his ministers, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not choose the language of compromise. He chose the language of truth. Standing before the cabinet, his words cut through decades of financial jargon and diplomatic phrases. This is not debt, this is control. In one sentence, he stripped away the layers of legality that had masked injustice for generations. For too long, African leaders had been told that loans were progress, that austerity was discipline, that dependency was partnership. Yet the evidence stood in front of them. Debts signed by past regimes, interest paid on chains never chosen, resources drained before they nourished their own people. To legitimize those debts, Traore declared, would be to mortgage the nation's future on terms written by others. He spoke not only to his ministers, but to history. If the nation bows today, there will be nothing left to stand on tomorrow. The room fell silent under the weight of that warning. It was not merely policy under discussion, it was destiny. From that silence emerged a vision bold enough to challenge centuries of practice. Why should African wealth be stored in vaults beneath Paris or London? Why should the backbone of the continent serve as collateral for loans dictated by the International Monetary Fund? Why should sovereignty itself be priced in foreign currencies? His answer was both practical and symbolic. The creation of an African gold reserve, held on African soil, guarded by African armies, and sustained by African people. This reserve would not belong to Burkina Faso alone. It would be the shield of the Sahel, a foundation for credit independent of IMF terms, and a banner of dignity for future generations. Economists in the region calculated that even a modest start pooling the reserves of Burkina, Mali, And Niger, valued at over 1.2 billion United States dollars, could reduce dependence on IMF loans by nearly a third. Billions of dollars saved in interest could be redirected into solar grids, irrigation systems, and schools. Yet beyond the arithmetic, the vision carried a moral weight. It told every child in the Sahel that their wealth would not be mortgaged away, but guarded for their future. And the people heard him. In villages and cities, miners volunteered their skills. Farmers pledged grain to feed soldiers guarding construction sites. Teachers offered small contributions, some as little as $10, others more. Each act was not about the amount given, but about ownership claimed. For the first time, citizens were not merely witnesses to policy, they were participants in sovereignty. The symbolism traveled fast. Murals appeared on the walls of Ouagadougou, depicting great vaults carved into desert rock. Children painted slogans, "Guard the gold, guard the future." Across Bamako and Niamey, rallies echoed the same cry. Even skeptics admitted that whether the reserve could be built overnight or not, the psychology of dependency was being broken. Western commentators dismissed the plan as reckless populism. Yet in Africa it was seen for what it was, a declaration that the age of one-sided dependency was ending. And in that declaration, Captain Ibrahim's latest news traveled not only across the Sahel but across the globe, igniting debates in parliaments, universities, and living rooms. So the question rises beyond economics. Can one leader's defiance, voiced in words simple yet unyielding, mark the beginning of Africa's financial independence? Or will the machinery of global finance prove too entrenched to break? And to you, the listener, if you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say Amen in the comments below. The counterstrike was swift and calculated. Within weeks of Traoré's defiant speech, the financial arteries of Burkina Faso were deliberately constricted. Insurance firms withdrew coverage on shipments. Banks delayed or froze transactions involving gold. Cargo once destined for Asia sat idle in European ports, trapped not by storms or strikes but by invisible signatures of power. It was financial warfare, silent yet suffocating. Western media wasted no time in shaping the narrative. Editorials in Paris and London branded the young captain as reckless, naive, even dangerous. Commentators painted the protests as instability, the new gold reserve as fantasy, and the defiance of the Sahel as a threat to global order. The intention was clear: to isolate, to discredit, and to convince ordinary Africans that resistance was futile. Yet on the ground, the reaction was the opposite. Farmers, miners, students, and elders refused to bend. They carried a new slogan through the markets and into the squares: better hunger and freedom than bread in chains. It was not the cry of despairing people, it was the anthem of a nation rediscovering dignity. And just when the squeeze seemed most severe, unexpected doors opened. In New Delhi, Indian refiners offered to bypass European ports and purchase gold directly from Burkina Faso. The terms were straightforward: fair price, immediate payment, no political strings. For a nation under siege, it was not just commerce, it was solidarity. In Moscow and Beijing, firms arrived with more than words. They proposed technology to refine gold locally, transforming raw bars into finished products that could fetch 20 to 25% higher margins on the world market. No longer would the Sahel simply export unprocessed wealth. It could add value, create jobs, and retain a larger share of the profit. Each blockade thus became a lesson. Each sanction became an incentive to diversify. What was meant to suffocate instead nurtured resilience. For the first time in decades, Africans saw that dependency was not inevitable, that alternatives existed if only the courage was found to seize them. This transformation was not without risk. Sanctions tightened, supplies grew scarce, international institutions whispered of further isolation. Yet in Ouagadougou, people remembered the words of their leader: "If we bow today, there will be nothing left to stand on tomorrow." Those words echoed in the chants of children painting murals, in the prayers of mothers, in the determination of soldiers guarding borders. Observers abroad struggled to reconcile the image. Was this chaos or courage, instability or independence? For many in the Sahel, the answer was already written in their hearts. They would rather endure hardship together than live comfortably under chains. Even in foreign capitals, doubts began to surface. Could sanctions truly extinguish a movement fueled not by luxury but by conviction? Could financial blockades silence a population that had already chosen dignity over ease? Each headline, each attempt at ridicule, only seemed to harden the resolve within Africa. It became clear that the struggle was no longer about one shipment of gold. It was about rewriting the rules of engagement. Every refusal to bow, every partnership outside the dollar system, every chant of better hunger and freedom than bread in chains, marked a new chapter in Africa's long story of resistance. The truth slipped into daylight, not through speeches, but through a leak. Documents from a European bank revealed what many had long suspected. The freezing of $300 million worth of gold was no bureaucratic accident. It was a direct order from Washington, stamped with urgency, marked as a tool to preserve control. For decades, the IMF had wielded loans as chains, binding nations to repayment schedules that siphoned wealth from generation to generation. But now, with Ouagadougou exploring BRICS partnerships and daring to dream of an African gold reserve, that leverage was slipping away. The leak confirmed it. Dependency had never been natural. It had always been engineered. Traore seized the moment with words as sharp as the evidence itself. They call it law, but law is not theft. His statement rang out in universities, where young scholars dissected the documents in classrooms. It echoed in marketplaces, where vendors turned his words into slogans. Across Africa, the narrative shifted. What Western outlets framed as recklessness now looked unmistakably like coercion disguised as legality. Analysts added figures to outrage. Africa paid nearly $30 billion annually in interest to global lenders. Money that could build roads, power grids, and digital infrastructure instead vanished into foreign vaults. If those debts were rooted in manipulation rather than mutual agreement, was it not time to question their legitimacy? The revelation gave the continent something more powerful than anger: proof. And proof, once public, is difficult to bury. The response rippled across borders. From Bamako came a pledge of uranium. From Conakry, a commitment of bauxite. From Niamey, promises of support in kind and spirit. Each contribution was more than a resource. It was a declaration that Africa's wealth would no longer be mortgaged away. Together, these nations proclaimed that the proposed gold reserve would not be Burkina's vault alone. It would be a symbol of a united continent. Murals sprang up in Ouagadougou, painted vaults carved into stone, guarded by soldiers in Sahel uniforms. Children scrawled the words, "Guard the gold, guard the future." In Bamako and Niamey, rallies filled the squares. The vision had grown beyond one country. It had become continental. Western capitals scrambled for counter-narratives, branding the reserve a reckless gamble. Yet each attempt only deepened the resolve of those who saw in it not a gamble, but a beginning. Instead of shame, it produced solidarity. Instead of silence, it produced slogans. Instead of isolation, it produced unity. The more they were pressured, the stronger the movement became. In speeches, Traore reminded his people that even if the seized gold was never returned, something far greater had already been won: the conviction that sovereignty is not charity, but responsibility. That dignity is not negotiable. That wealth is not collateral, but freedom. And so the young captain began to transcend his own office. He was no longer just the leader of Burkina Faso. He was becoming a living emblem of resistance, a figure around whom a new African identity could coalesce. His words, his defiance, his vision had grown larger than himself. Yet the question lingered, hanging in the air like a challenge. Can this symbol outlive one leader, one nation, and truly reshape Africa's place in the global order? Or will the machinery of global finance once again smother the fire before it spreads? The answer was unwritten. But the streets of Ouagadougou, the chants of Bamako, the pledges of Niamey and Conakry, all whispered the same hope. This time, the fire might just endure. The story began with a shock. $300 million in gold, frozen at a European port, became more than a financial dispute. It became the spark of a continental awakening. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the halls of the Alliance of Sahel States, from protests in Bamako to pledges in Niamey, Africa remembered a truth too long ignored: sovereignty cannot be borrowed, and dignity cannot be priced. In that moment, Captain Ibrahim's latest news was not only about a shipment or a policy, it was about a principle. Wealth mined by African hands must serve African futures. His words, "This is not debt, this is control," cut through the fog of contracts and interest rates, reminding millions that behind every clause lies power, and behind every rule lies choice. The attempt to bury a nation in humiliation instead planted a seed of solidarity. What Western capitals called reckless, Africans called renewal. What they named instability, the people named courage. This was not the end of struggle, but the rebirth of conviction. And though the machinery of global finance remains strong, the will of a united continent is stronger still. Today, when you hear Burkina Faso latest news, know that it is no longer just about one nation. It is about the possibility of an Africa that keeps its gold in African vaults, its future in African hands, its destiny beyond foreign dictates. The question is no longer whether Africa will resist. The question is whether the world is ready for Africa to rise. So let this be our echo. Africa rise. If this story moved something in your chest, do not scroll past. Like, share, speak. Subscribe because they hid our history long enough. Let us speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. Captain Ibrahim, latest news will continue to unfold, and we will be here to tell it. We will see you in the next story, the kind they still do not want you to hear.